The night Margaret Wilson was thrown out of her own house, she stood in the cold rain with one small suitcase in her hand. Her son looked her directly in the eyes and said, "Mom, you can't stay here anymore." Margaret stared at him. "Here?" She looked behind him at the beautiful house she had lived in for 32 years. The house with the white columns. The house where her children had taken their first steps. The house where she had buried her husband. The house where she had spent her entire life sacrificing everything for her family. Her daughter-in-law folded her arms. "You need to understand, Margaret. This is not a nursing home." Margaret looked at her son. "Daniel, you promised your father you would never let me be alone." Daniel looked away. Then he said the words that broke something inside her forever. "Promises change." Her daughter, Rebecca, stood beside him. She did not hug her mother. She did not cry. She simply said, "Mom, maybe it's time you accepted that your children have their own lives." Margaret looked at all of them. Her son, her daughter, her grandchildren, the family she had spent 40 years protecting. And then she smiled. Not because she was happy, but because, for the first time in her life, she finally understood something. They thought they had thrown an old woman out of her home. They had no idea they had just thrown out the woman who owned everything. Margaret Wilson was 72 years old. For most people, 72 meant retirement, slow mornings, quiet afternoons, a comfortable life surrounded by people who loved you. But Margaret's life had never been easy. She had been married to Thomas Wilson for 43 years. Thomas had been a hardworking construction contractor. He built houses. He repaired buildings. He worked with his hands. And when he died, Margaret believed the hardest part of her life was over. She was wrong. The hardest part was discovering what her family had become after he was gone. Margaret had 2 children. Daniel was 46. Rebecca was 42. When they were young, Margaret had done everything for them. She worked at a small grocery store during the day. At night, she cleaned offices. She rarely slept more than 5 hours. She remembered buying Daniel his first baseball glove. She remembered Rebecca's first school dance. She remembered standing outside the hospital when Rebecca gave birth to her first child. Margaret had always believed that family was everything. She believed that if you gave your children love, they would give love back. But life had taught her something different. Sometimes you can give someone your entire life, and they can still treat you like a burden. The Wilson house stood on 3 acres of land outside a small town in Virginia. It was not a mansion, but it was beautiful. A 2-story brick house with a large porch, old oak trees, and a long driveway. Thomas had bought the property in 1981. Back then, the land had been almost worthless. People laughed at him for buying so much land. But Thomas had seen something others had not. The town was growing. New roads were being built. Businesses were coming. And the property would one day become extremely valuable. Margaret never paid much attention to real estate. She trusted her husband. After Thomas died, she continued living in the house. Daniel and Rebecca slowly began visiting more often. At first, Margaret was happy. Daniel would say, "Mom, we just want to make sure you're okay." Rebecca would bring groceries. Her grandchildren would visit. Margaret felt loved again. But slowly, things began to change. Daniel started talking about money. "Mom, this property must be worth a lot now." Margaret would smile. "I suppose it is. How much do you think?" "I don't know," Daniel laughed. "You should find out." Margaret never told him that she already knew. After Thomas died, she had hired a lawyer to organize his estate. That was when she discovered something her husband had never told anyone. The property was not only valuable, it was connected to a development agreement. The town had plans for a commercial project near the area, and because Margaret owned the land, the developers had offered her a fortune. But Margaret had refused to sell. She wanted to keep the house. She wanted to keep the land. It was the last thing she had left from Thomas. Her children did not know that, and Margaret never told them, because she wanted to know one thing. Would they love her if she had nothing? The answer came slowly. Daniel began visiting less. Rebecca became impatient. One afternoon, Margaret fell in the kitchen. She did not break anything, but she could not stand up for almost 20 minutes. When Daniel arrived, he did not ask if she was okay. He looked around the house. "Mom, you really can't keep living alone." Margaret looked at him. "I've lived here for 30 years. You're getting older." "I know. You need help," Margaret smiled. "Maybe I do," Daniel nodded. "Rebecca and I have been talking." Margaret felt something in her chest tight. "About what?" "About your future." "My future?" Daniel sighed. We think you should move into assisted living. Margaret stared at him. She had never felt so small. I don't need assisted living. You fell. People fall. You forget things. I forget where I put my glasses. That's not what I mean. Margaret looked at him. What do you mean? Daniel didn't answer. And that silence told her everything. He did not want to take care of her. He wanted the house. 3 weeks later, Daniel organized a family meeting. He invited Rebecca, his wife, Laura, Rebecca's husband, Michael. Everyone sat around Margaret's dining table. The same table where Margaret had served Thanksgiving dinner for decades. The same table where her children had done homework. The same table where she had once helped Daniel write his college application. Now they were sitting around it like a board of directors. Daniel placed a folder on the table. Mom, we've made some decisions. Margaret looked at the folder. What kind of decisions? Rebecca spoke. We think you should move to a senior living community. Margaret looked at her. Do you? Rebecca avoided her eyes. It would be better for everyone. Everyone? For you. Margaret smiled sadly. No, say what you mean. The room became silent. Rebecca looked at Daniel. Daniel finally said, the house is too much for you. Margaret nodded. And what happens to the house? Nobody answered. That was the answer. Margaret stood up. You want me out? Daniel looked uncomfortable. That's not fair. You want me out of my home. Mom, nobody is trying to hurt you. Margaret laughed softly. Then why does it feel like everyone is standing around me with a knife? Laura suddenly spoke. You need to stop making everything emotional. Margaret looked at her. This is my home. Laura shrugged. And we are your family. Margaret looked around the table. No, she whispered. You are people who want my home. The final betrayal happened on a cold November evening. Margaret had been sick for several days. She called Daniel. Can you come over? Daniel answered after several rings. What happened? I don't feel well. Do you need an ambulance? No. Then what do you need? Margaret paused. I need my son. There was silence. Then Daniel sighed. Mom, I can't keep dropping everything every time you feel lonely. Margaret closed her eyes. I didn't say I was lonely. You don't have to. That night, Rebecca came to the house. But she did not come alone. Daniel was with her. Laura was in the car. Rebecca walked inside carrying a suitcase. Margaret looked at it. What is that? Rebecca said. You're coming with us. Where? To a temporary care facility. Margaret stood up. No. Daniel entered the room. Mom, don't make this difficult. Margaret stared at him. Difficult? You can't take care of yourself. I have taken care of myself my entire life. Daniel looked at the house. This isn't your home anymore. Margaret felt the world stop. What did you say? Daniel's voice became harder. You need to leave. Margaret looked at Rebecca. Is this what you want? Rebecca began to cry, but she did not say no. That hurt Margaret more than anything. She slowly walked upstairs. She packed 3 dresses, 2 sweaters, a pair of shoes, a photograph of Thomas, and an old wooden jewelry box. That was all, 40 years of life. 1 suitcase. When she came downstairs, Daniel was waiting. He opened the front door. Rain was falling outside. Margaret stood on the porch. She looked back one final time, then she turned toward her son. Daniel, he looked at her. You'll regret this. Daniel shook his head. Mom, this isn't a movie. Margaret looked at him. No, she whispered. It isn't. Then she walked away. Margaret was taken to a small assisted living facility. It was clean, the staff was kind, but she felt like a prisoner. For 3 days, nobody from her family visited. On the 4th day, Rebecca called. Mom, how are you? Margaret looked out the window. Fine. Daniel says you need to sign some papers. What papers? Just documents related to the house. Margaret smiled. There it was. The real reason. Why? To make things easier. For whom? Rebecca did not answer. Margaret ended the call. The next morning, she called the only person she trusted, her husband's old attorney. His name was Robert Hayes. He was 80 years old now, but he still remembered Thomas. When Margaret told him what had happened, Robert was silent for a long time. Then he said, Margaret, I think it's time. Time for what? To tell them the truth. Margaret looked at the photograph of Thomas. She had kept the secret for 12 years, the secret that could destroy everything her children thought they owned. Robert continued. Are you sure? Margaret's voice was calm. They threw me out of my home. Yes. They took my clothes. Yes. They left me in the rain. Yes. Margaret closed her eyes. Then let them discover what they really did. The next morning, Margaret signed a series of documents. Robert had prepared them years earlier. The truth was simple. The property belonged entirely to Margaret. Not Daniel, not Rebecca, not their spouses, not their children, Margaret, every inch of land, every building, every legal right, the house they lived in, the land they planned to sell, the property they had secretly discussed dividing between themselves. All of it belonged to her. And there was more. The land had recently been appraised at over $4 million. A major development company had been negotiating to purchase it. The offer was $6.8 million. Margaret had refused. But now she changed her mind. She called the developer. I want to sell. Robert looked at her. Are you sure? Margaret looked out the window. Yes. Your children will lose the house. Margaret turned around. They already took my home from me. Robert said nothing. Margaret continued. I am not destroying their lives. She paused. I am simply no longer sacrificing mine to protect them. While Margaret was preparing her revenge, Daniel and Rebecca were celebrating. They believed the house belonged to them. Daniel had already contacted a real estate agent. Rebecca had started planning renovations. Laura had created a list of furniture she wanted. Michael had calculated how much money each sibling could make from selling the land. They had even started discussing what they would do with the money. Daniel wanted a new luxury home. Rebecca wanted to pay off her debts. Laura wanted a new SUV. Nobody called Margaret. Nobody asked how she was. They were too busy planning the future. A future they did not own. One morning, a man in a dark suit arrived at the house. Daniel opened the door. Can I help you? The man smiled. My name is David Carter. I'm with Carter Development Group. Daniel frowned. Why are you here? David looked at the property. I'm here regarding the sale. Daniel froze. What sale? David handed him a folder. The sale of this property. Daniel opened it. His face changed. What is this? David replied, the purchase agreement. Daniel stared at the document. This property is not for sale. David smiled politely. It is. Who authorized this? David looked at the name on the contract. Margaret Wilson. Daniel's face went pale. Daniel called Rebecca. She arrived 20 minutes later. What happened? Daniel handed her the papers. Rebecca read them. Then she laughed. This is impossible. Daniel shook his head. No. She can't sell the house. She owns it. Rebecca stared at him. What do you mean? Daniel looked at her. Mom owns the property. Rebecca became silent. No. Yes. How? Dad left it to her. Rebecca sat down. For years, they had believed the house belonged to the family. They believed their mother was simply living there. They believed that one day the property would be divided between them, but they had never checked. They had never asked. They had simply assumed, and now the truth was destroying everything. Rebecca called Margaret. Margaret answered. Hello? Mom. Margaret recognized the fear in her daughter's voice. What do you want? Can we talk? You had many opportunities to talk. Mom, please. About what? The property. Margaret was silent. Rebecca whispered, You're selling the house? Yes. You can't. Margaret almost laughed. Why not? Because it's our home. Margaret's voice became quiet. No, it is. No, Rebecca. Margaret looked around the small room where she now lived. It was my home. The next day, Daniel visited Margaret. He entered the facility wearing an expensive suit. He looked nervous. Margaret was sitting near a window. She did not stand. Mom, Daniel, he sat down. I want to apologize. Margaret looked at him. For what? He swallowed. For the way things happened. Margaret smiled. Which part? Daniel looked away. She can't sell the house. She owns it. Rebecca stared at him. What do you mean? Daniel looked at her. Mom owns the property. Rebecca became silent. No, yes. How? Dad left it to her. Rebecca sat down. For years, they had believed the house belonged to the family. They believed their mother was simply living there. They believed that one day the property would be divided between them, but they had never checked. They had never asked. They had simply assumed, and now the truth was destroying everything. Rebecca called Margaret. Margaret answered. Hello? Mom. Margaret recognized the fear in her daughter's voice. What do you want? Can we talk? You had many opportunities to talk. Mom, please. About what? The property. Margaret was silent. Rebecca whispered, You're selling the house? Yes. You can't. Margaret almost laughed. Why not? Because it's our home. Margaret's voice became quiet. No, it is. No, Rebecca. Margaret looked around the small room where she now lived. It was my home. The next day, Daniel visited Margaret. He entered the facility wearing an expensive suit. He looked nervous. Margaret was sitting near a window. She did not stand. Mom, Daniel, he sat down. I want to apologize. Margaret looked at him. For what? He swallowed. For the way things happened. Margaret smiled. Which part? Daniel looked away. The night you left. You threw me out. I was under pressure. You threw me out. I thought you needed care. You threw me out. Daniel's jaw tightened. Mom, I made a mistake. Margaret looked at him. No, what? You made a choice. Daniel said nothing. Margaret continued. You chose your comfort over my dignity. That's not true. You chose the house over your mother. Mom. You told me it wasn't my home anymore. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. I didn't mean it. Margaret looked at him. But you said it. The room became silent. Then Daniel whispered, please don't sell the house. Margaret looked out the window. Why? Because it's our family home. Margaret turned toward him. When I was your family, you abandoned me. Daniel had no answer. Rebecca came 2 days later. She brought flowers. Margaret looked at them. Those are beautiful. Rebecca smiled nervously. I thought you might like them. Margaret nodded. Thank you. Rebecca sat beside her. Mom, I know I made mistakes. Margaret looked at her. You did. Rebecca started crying. I was confused. No, I was angry. No, I thought Daniel knew what he was doing. Margaret shook her head. You were an adult. Rebecca wiped her eyes. You're my mother, and you are my daughter. Then why are you doing this? Margaret looked at her for a long time. I am not doing this to you. Rebecca stared. You're selling our home. I am selling my property. You know what I mean. Margaret's voice became firm. No, Rebecca, I know exactly what you mean. Rebecca stood up. You're punishing us. Margaret looked at her. Yes. Rebecca froze. Margaret continued. Not because you wanted the house. Then why? Because you treated me like I was worthless. Rebecca started crying. Margaret did not move. You did not abandon a rich woman. You abandoned your mother. And now you are angry because the person you abandoned still had the power to choose her own future. When begging failed, the family became angry. Daniel accused Margaret of being cruel. Rebecca told relatives that her mother had become bitter. Laura told everyone that Margaret was mentally unstable. Soon, family members began calling. Margaret, you should think about your grandchildren. Margaret, family should forgive. Margaret, this is selfish. Margaret listened. Then she asked one question. Where were you when they threw me out? Nobody answered. One relative said, you should be the bigger person. Margaret smiled. I was the bigger person for 40 years. Then she hung up. She stopped explaining herself. She stopped defending herself. She stopped asking for love from people who had already shown her what they were willing to do without it. One evening, Margaret opened the old wooden jewelry box. Inside was a letter from Thomas. She had never opened it. The envelope had been marked. For Margaret, if I am gone before I can tell you. Her hands trembled. She opened it. The letter was written 12 years earlier. Thomas had known he was sick. He had known he might not have much time. The letter said, Margaret, if you are reading this, then I am no longer beside you. I know you will try to give everything away to the children. You always believed that loving them meant sacrificing everything. But please remember this. You spent your entire life building a home. Do not let anyone make you feel guilty for protecting it. The property is yours. The decision is yours. And if one day our children forget who you are, do not forget who you are. You are Margaret Wilson. You survived things they never saw. You built a life when we had nothing. You are not a burden. You are not helpless. And you do not owe anyone your destruction just because you once loved them. I love you, Thomas. Margaret read the letter 3 times. Then she cried. Not because she was sad. Because, for the first time in years, she felt understood. The development company offered Margaret $6.8 million. She accepted, but she added conditions. The new development would include affordable housing, a community center, and a small park named after Thomas. The family had expected her to sell the property and disappear. They had not expected her to use the money to build something bigger than the house. Margaret purchased a beautiful home in another town. She hired staff to help her. She donated millions to a foundation that helped elderly people who had been abandoned by their families. And then she did something else. She created a trust. But her children were not included. Neither were their spouses. Neither were their children. The trust went to the foundation. When Daniel found out, he exploded. You cut us out. Margaret looked at him. You cut yourself out. I am your son, and I was your mother. He stared at her. You would really leave us with nothing? Margaret answered calmly. No, Daniel looked confused. Margaret continued. I am leaving you exactly what you gave me. Nothing. The family had 30 days to leave the property. They had no legal argument. The house belonged to Margaret. The sale was final. Daniel tried to fight. He hired a lawyer. The lawyer reviewed the documents. Then he told Daniel, "You don't have a case." Daniel asked, "Why?" The lawyer replied, "Because your mother owns the property." Daniel sat silently. The man continued, "You should have checked before making plans." Daniel laughed bitterly. "That is what my mother said." The final day arrived. Daniel stood in the driveway. The house was empty. The furniture was gone. The family portraits were gone. The children's toys were gone. Everything they had assumed belonged to them was gone. A moving truck waited outside. Rebecca stood on the porch crying. She looked at the house. Then she whispered, "We lost everything." Daniel looked at her. "No," he stared at the empty house. "We lost the person who gave us everything." Before leaving, Daniel went to see Margaret one final time. She was sitting in her new home. The house was smaller, but beautiful. There were flowers outside, photographs of Thomas, and sunlight coming through the windows. Daniel stood at the door. Margaret looked at him. "Come in." He entered. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Daniel said, "I hate you." Margaret nodded. "I know. I hate that you did this. I know. I hate that you had the power." Margaret looked at him. "No," Daniel frowned. "What? You hate that you discovered I always had the power." He looked away. Margaret continued, "You thought I was weak because I was kind." Daniel's eyes filled with tears. "I was a terrible son." "Yes," he looked at her. "You could forgive me." Margaret shook her head. "No, why?" "Because forgiveness is a gift." Daniel stared. "And you don't want to give it to me." Margaret's voice remained calm. "No, after everything." Margaret looked directly into his eyes. "After everything." Daniel began crying. "I am still your son." Margaret nodded. "Yes, and you are still my mother." Margaret looked at him. "No, Daniel." Margaret opened the door. "Goodbye, Daniel." He stood there. "Mom," Margaret looked at him one final time. Then she said, "You should have remembered my worth before you discovered my property." And she closed the door. A year later, Margaret's life had completely changed. She traveled. She volunteered. She spent time with people who were grateful for her presence. She founded the Wilson Elder Care Foundation. The organization helped abandoned seniors find housing, legal support, and medical care. One afternoon, a reporter asked Margaret why she had created the foundation. Margaret smiled. "Because no elderly person should believe they are worthless just because their family forgot them." The reporter asked, "Do you regret what happened with your children?" Margaret thought about the question. Then she answered, "I regret that I raised them to believe love meant they could take everything from me." The reporter asked, "Do you ever miss them?" Margaret looked toward the sunset. "Sometimes. Do you want them back in your life?" Margaret shook her head. "Missing someone does not mean you should return to them." Years later, Daniel and Rebecca were living completely different lives. They had lost the property. They had lost the money they expected. But more than that, they had lost their mother. Daniel occasionally drove past the old property. The house was gone. The new development stood there now. There was a park, a community center, and a small stone monument. It read, Thomas and Margaret Wilson Community Park. One day, Daniel stood in front of the monument. He placed his hand on the stone, and for the first time, he understood. His mother had not taken their home. They had lost it long before. They lost it the night they told her she was a burden. They lost it when they watched her walk into the rain. They lost it when they chose property over love. And they lost her forever when they realized that the old woman they had abandoned was the owner of everything they had been fighting over. Margaret lived another 12 years. She never reconciled with her children. She never apologized. She never gave them another chance. Some people believed she was cruel, but Margaret knew the truth. She had forgiven herself. And sometimes, that is the only forgiveness a person truly needs. Because the greatest revenge is not destroying the people who hurt you. The greatest revenge is surviving them, building a better life, and becoming so peaceful that they can no longer reach you. Margaret Wilson lost her family, but she found herself. And in the end, that was the one thing they could never take from her.